possessed of many material trappings, yet they were held in high regard within the community on account of Javad's status as a respected religious cleric. He often led Friday prayers and was consulted by local leaders. Similarly, Ali's mother was well educated and taught him about Persian history, art and literature. Khamenei has since emphasized the austere lifestyle of his childhood, claiming that the family lived in a one-room house with little else beyond a basement and subsisted primarily on bread, dates and raisins. This is quite possibly an exaggeration of how modest their lives were. Khamenei's life was shaped by political developments in his homeland from even before he was born. Iran, or Persia as it was known throughout history until modern times, was one of less than a dozen nations in the Middle East, Africa and Asia that was not colonized in the 19th century. Iran thus sits alongside Abyssinia or Ethiopia and Liberia in Africa, as well as countries such as Japan, China and Siam in Asia. Persia had a long and proud history, with empires having emerged from this part of Central Asia since antiquity. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, it was the power in the region which stopped the further eastward expansion of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. This occurred under the Safavid dynasty. At the end of the 18th century, the Qajar dynasty came to power. The Qajar rulers adhered to Twelver Shia Islam, a branch of Shia Islam which holds that there were 12 legitimate imams or leaders of the Islamic faith after the Prophet Muhammad, beginning with his son-in-law Ali and ending with Muhammad al-Mahdi, the latter of whom will, like the second coming of Christ in Christian belief, re-emerge one day to redeem the Islamic faith. The Qajar dynasty's adherence to Twelver Shia forms an important link with the Iranian Revolution, which would start Khamenei's ascent to become the supreme leader of Iran in modern times. The Qajar rulers technically reigned down to 1925. However, already in 1921, the Middle East had been reshaped after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. In that year, a military coup had occurred in Iran, which was led by a military officer by the name of Reza Shah Pahlavi. He claimed full power in 1925 and established the Pahlavi dynasty, a much more secular-orientated royal house. He was himself overthrown in 1941 during the Second World War, after the British and Soviets invaded Iran out of fear that it was about to ally with Nazi Germany. His 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed on the throne, though Iran remained under close Allied oversight for the duration of the war. Post-1945, he began to rule in his own right. His lengthy reign of nearly 4 decades was a strange mix of authoritarianism and liberalism, in which Iran was one of the few countries in the Middle East with a relaxed religious environment. However, the Shah's secret police, the Savak, oversaw a system of mass surveillance, repression and torture of perceived opponents of the regime. The Shah's regime was anxious to keep a handle on religious movements that it believed might challenge the secular rule of the Shah. Despite this, Iran was home to many religious schools that adhered to rigid and conservative values, and Iran remained a profoundly religious society even under the Shah's rule. Khamenei's early life reflected this. In the mid-1950s, he began studying under leading religious scholars like Ayatollah Sheikh Hashem Khasvani in Mashdad. The city was a renowned religious site owing to it being the resting place of the 8th Imam of Twelver Shia, Ali ibn Musa. Mashdad was also home to many Shia scholars and Ayatollahs other than Ali's father. Ayatollah is a name for a high-ranking religious leader or scholar within Twelver Shia Islam. From Mashdad, Khamenei crossed the border briefly to study in the city of Najaf in Iraq, the burial place of Ali, the first Imam of Shia Islam. As the resting place of Ali, Najaf is consequently amongst the holiest places in the world for Shia Muslims. After a brief period there, Khamenei returned to Iran and settled in the city of Qom. It was here that he began studying under Ayatollah Khomeini in 1957, the individual who, over 2 decades later, would become the first supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. By 1957, Khomeini was already developing a reputation as a prominent opponent of the Shah's regime. Khamenei's life was shaped in many ways by the events of 1963. Early that year, the Shah launched a policy program designed to modernize Iran along Western lines and expand its economy. A core element of what is termed the White Revolution included an attempt to reform the system of landholding in Iran. This threatened to undermine the traditional structures of Persian society and aroused opposition from within the clerical class. In the midst of it, Ayatollah Khomeini became even more vocal in his opposition to the Shah's regime than he had been already. He was placed under arrest, an action which led to protests around the country in June 1963, during which hundreds of people lost their lives. The Ayatollah continued to denounce both the Shah and the influence of his Western allies in Iran, particularly that of the United States. As a result, the Shah determined that the best way to deal with the threat of Khomeini was to simply remove him from Iran. In 1964, Khomeini was sent into exile. He spent over 14 years outside of Iran, first briefly in Turkey, then primarily in Iraq. Towards the end of the 1970s, he spent a few months in France. In Iraq, he became a focus for foreign opposition to the Shah, and as a result, fellow dissidents joined him in exile there. Khamenei was not among them. Although he was a keen supporter of his former teacher and his political views, Ali remained in Iran. He also left Qom and returned to his native Mashdad to help care for his aging father, who had become blind in one eye. This is significant for later events, as it meant that Khamenei never completed the full religious training at Qom or Tehran. This religious training, for some, was later perceived as vital to qualify for the position of the supreme leader of the country. Khamenei did begin to play a major role in the clerical opposition to the Shah's rule within Iran in the period between the White Revolution in 1963 and the Iranian Revolution of the late 1970s. In 1967, he helped translate The Future in Islamic Lands by the Egyptian religious scholar Sayyid Qutb from the Arabic into Farsi. Qutb was a major influence on the subsequent development of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda. His book called for religious revolution to overthrow secular forces across the Middle East, like the government of the Shah. Khamenei also wrote a foreword to the translation, which bluntly stated that, quote, "The future belongs to Islam." Publication of the book was broadly prevented by Savak, the Shah's secret police. It was the beginning of a period in which Khamenei was arrested on several occasions and held for months at a time. In between these periods of detention, he traveled around the country and gave sermons and speeches in which he railed against the Shah. His most prolonged period of arrest was in 1975, when he was detained in Tehran between January and August of that year. During this time, he was largely kept in solitary confinement, and his family was not informed as to his location. Undeterred, in 1977, he helped found the Association of Competent Clergy, which, as the name suggests, was a religious group set up to oppose the regime. Khamenei's family life was modest during these years. In 1964, after returning to Mashdad from Qom, he married his sole wife, Mansoure Khojaste Bagherzadeh. Despite his subsequent standing within Iranian society, very little is known about her. There are, for instance, no photographs of her, and few even know what she looks like. In an interview which she once gave, she described how she and her husband had discussed the possibility of his arrest by the Shah's government from the earliest days of their marriage. Mansoureh stated that she agreed with her husband's mission. She viewed her own role as being to provide stability in their household during his frequent bouts of imprisonment. They had 6 children, 4 sons named Mostafa, Mojtaba, Masood and Meysam, and 2 daughters, Khoda and Boshra. The family continued to live a relatively frugal life even after the Iranian Revolution and Khamenei's rise to power. Khamenei is also said to have been a more open-minded religious cleric in some respects than his contemporaries, such as the Ayatollah Khamenei. Ali, for instance, was known to read Western books like the works of the American author John Steinbeck. This doesn't necessarily suggest he was approving of Western culture, but it does demonstrate a greater desire to understand the mind of the average American and Westerner in a way which the Ayatollah did not countenance. Several of the Western books which Khamenei read simply intensified the cleric's critical views of Western culture. By the time that Khamenei contributed to the founding of the Association of Competent Clergy in 1977, the political environment in Iran was deteriorating. In spite of efforts by the Shah and his secret police to clamp down on opposition, anti-Pahlavi sentiment was growing, and there were an increasing number of public demonstrations of unrest. Opposition swelled in 1978, driven by riots and police crackdowns that led to hundreds of deaths. A galvanizing incident was the Cinema Rex fire of the 19th of August 1978, when over 400 people were killed after the cinema in question in the city of Abadan was barricaded shut and set on fire. Islamic terrorists were probably responsible, but the Shah's government was blamed at the time. A sign of how weak the regime had become was seen when it pressured the government of Saddam Hussein to force Ayatollah Khomeini out of Iraq. It was clear that Khomeini's presence in Iran's neighboring country was feared by the Shah's regime. Khomeini left for France, even as the protests intensified in Iran in the final months of 1978. The Iranian Revolution came to a peak in January 1979, when hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets of Tehran and other cities. Meanwhile, the Shah, whose health was in severe decline, fled from Iran on the 16th of January 1979. By then, the Islamic Revolutionary Council had been formed as a 13-man body, charged with overseeing the transition to Islamic rule as the Shah's government collapsed. Its actions were clandestine. However, it was revealed in 1980 that Khamenei was a member. This was a revelation which surprised many and which signified his ascent as one of the leaders of the revolution. Just over 2 weeks after the Shah's flight, the Ayatollah landed at Mehrabad International Airport in Tehran from France on the 1st of February. Over the next 10 days, what remained of the secular government that had controlled Iran since the 1920s collapsed. The 11th of February is typically celebrated today as the conclusion of the Iranian Revolution, 10 days after the Ayatollah's return to the country. The Iranian Revolution had succeeded in overthrowing the government of the Shah. Yet the issue of what kind of alternative government would take its place was not as simple an issue as is often assumed. The opposition to the Pahlavi dynasty had not been a unified Islamist movement led by Ayatollah Khomeini from exile and by clerics like Ali Khamenei from within. Instead, opposition to the Shah had consisted of a broad coalition of Shia clerics, other Islamic groups, more secular-minded politicians, and even left-wing entities tied to the Soviet Union within the context of the Cold War. Throughout 1979, there was a tug-of-war between these varying groups to see what kind of political system would be put in place. There were many who wished for a continuation of the kind of secular society that the Shah had overseen, just with the Shah removed and a Western-style democracy created. However, the pro-democracy and moderate Islamist factions lost out in the course of 1979 as the Ayatollah and the clerics cemented their control over the country. In December 1979, Khomeini was established as the first supreme leader of the newly created Islamic Republic of Iran.